So, Professor Taylor, thank you for having me. I want to ask you mainly about your concept of reenchantment, as you employed it in the papers Disenchantment-Reenchantment, and Recovering the Sacred. So I'll take these papers as a starting point. I think it's interesting in Disenchantment-Reenchantment you argue for reenchantment by elaborating on the concept of strong evaluation. And I've been reading Recovering the Sacred as a variation on the same theme, where you explain reenchantment in more theistic terms, as an aspiration to save the sacred. And I think both approaches are interesting and that there's a lot more to be said about them. Now, as I understand your work as a whole, it can be seen in many ways as a project of reenchantment. And one of your major efforts is to argue against reductionism in various fields, such as philosophical anthropology, ethics, and ontology. Now, I think reenchantment seems a fitting term to describe the positive tenet of your anti-reductionist project. Yet, you've made it clear in various writings that disenchantment is in a way an irreversible process, and that it's clear that that the aspiration to re-enchant cannot be understood in terms of a simple return to the enchanted world of spirits and moral forces. So before discussing what is involved in seeking re-enchantment, I want to ask how you understand disenchantment and the challenges it poses for us. Now, disenchantment is often seen as a sense that something is both gained and lost in the process of modernity. So my first question would be, how do you understand these gains and losses?
Yeah, well, I think that disenchantment has at least two meanings, and a third one which is very invalid. In a way, Weber a little bit mixes the three. One meaning is one that you immediately suggested by the word ensemble, that is a conception of the world as full of magic forces and that emanating from objects, that we have some of them very dangerous and so on, a sense of vulnerability which you see in our pre-modern, let's say 1500 ancestors in Europe, and you see in lots of parts of the world even today. Well, the sort of demagification, undoing magic, or in a certain sense you could say the Western concept of magic is a little bit formed from the practices that were expelled by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and so on, right? So that's one sense, and it leads to the idea of a world, the world of ultimately explicable in terms of Newtonian mechanics or whatever succeeds it. The second level, I think, is very important in modern disenchantment is the conception that people had now in elites rather than masses in an early modern period or before of cosmic order. Cosmic order which reflects some, if you like, moral stages, moral statuses in a universe, so that what's highest in the universe has the meaning of eternity, and what's lower has the meaning of lesser being, and so on. And the very powerful notions of societies as somehow encrusted in that moral order. So you get the notion of a society's orders, aristocracy, clergy, and so on, as being rightfully there because they reflect the shape of the universe. And these are two understanding, more than just ideas, two sort of ways of understanding ourselves, which I think have totally disappeared. And what I call the immanent frame is what we now live in. The world is understood, the natural world is understood through the best natural science of the day, and the human world is understood as created by human beings. So no regime reflects the order of things. Regimes are set up at datable times by identifiable people, the fathers of the U.S. Constitution or whatever, and etc. And there's a human decision all the way down. And so I think there you have two meanings. The third meaning, which Weber sometimes uses, which is the decline of religion, the decline of faith. It's, as Hans Joas is showing in this wonderful big book he just produced, I don't know if you've seen it, is definitely not coordinate with the first two, because in a certain sense it's changes in religious faith which help to drive the first two. So But now, my point is that reenchantment is neither of those two coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is it? You have to say. But the issue is, one way of putting the issue is, can we just look on the physical universe surrounding us as a law of matter, which has its own internal laws, but we are not violate them for our own sake, but otherwise there's no claim on us, or not something we need to be somehow in contact with. And I think that there's a very strong set of intuitions that this is not the case, something more than that. So the best place, I think, to look, well, there are two places to look at this in order to get an idea of what could be involved. Number one, and this is something I'm working on now, the post-romantic poetics, I'm mainly looking at poetics, but it could be extended to the other arts, seems to me to be a departure in which great nostalgia for the age when the notion of cosmic order was there and you could touch it, on one hand, but also a sense that you can't go back to that. So what you get, a good example is Hamann, right? That he uses one of the conceptions of an order built into the universe, which is to think of it as a script, as a language, the language of God. And we can't quite get that. What we do is we translate it into speech that is meaningful to us. So the famous line of Hamann, Reden ist übersetzen, I like quoting because it really gives this sense of, and interesting, I think a lot of Benjamin is built on that idea. Or I see in this American critic who wrote the Sutler language, at my age, very familiar names aren't immediately available, so I leave them alone when they come back. But his idea is the same sort of idea, that the belief in these orders is no longer really available, so people are kind of inventing the orders. Mm-hmm. And he puts it in a much too subjectivist mode, I think. They sort of invent them and live within them. But so excellent examples are something like Wordsworth, Ginger Abbey, but you can get a lot of very good examples, and of course the German Romantics and Hölderlin and Novalis and so on. And I'm trying to follow that through in a whole lot of ways in which that's continued. But what is being done here is something of the following kind. The sense of the importance of art is being, as it were, expressed or realized with the idea that these works of art, if we really inhabit them, give us a very strong sense of connection with them. Yeah? And so strong that for a lot of people they carry conviction. The conviction they carry is that there is some connection here. The conviction they fail to carry or couldn't carry is that we have the right description of it. So there's a kind of distance from, right? Mm-hmm. There's something that we know not what, but there's a connection here. And of course, the second great source of ideas about this and attempting to kind of triangulate into something here is totally pre-modern, even pre-civilizational understandings of humans in the cosmos. Because you go to any early society and you get some such idea, which is central, right? The idea of a certain place is the only place that humans can live, and then there's a long story told. And these are generally in our disenchanted age, people really into disenchantment consider it just so many illusions. Yeah. But I think that they're very interesting places to try to get a sense for what the world we are living in. In other words, all these different takes, the one that is expressed in a poem or a piece of music or painting, on one hand, and the ones that you see worked out in earlier cultures on the other hand. And we're in a situation where we have all these takes which we can't consider as the last word, but perhaps we begin to get an understanding of what our relationship to the universe might be. And it's very interesting because in the present political situation in Canada, there's an attempt by a lot of people to make up for the appalling way in which we treated the Aboriginals, the original inhabitants, the total rejection of their worldview, considering it, so on. And part of the recovery of a sense of, a sense in some of these tribes that haven't been, whose way of life has not been totally destroyed. Some of them, the ones that are closer to the original settlement, just been completely assimilated. But they don't even speak the language anymore. Around, center of Quebec, the Huron went up, they all speak French, but not even sure what the original language was. But then even you go farther west and farther out, you get cases where the really big problem is getting a sense of confidence that they can run their own show. And that really is tremendously helped, if you can call back the elements of the traditional culture. And these involve sense of the world around us. Right? So a lot of people are now studying that, where cross-cultural people studying that, in other words, mainstream Canadians coming in from other continents over the last 5 centuries and are working together with people from those communities. So there is here a kind of searching going on, which probably will never yield the kind of certainty about the nature of the cosmos which 3 centuries ago our ancestors, or was it 3 or 4, our ancestors enjoyed. It's going to be a continuing process of exploration, but the assumption underlying all this is there's something here to explore. Right? It's not simply to be understood as subjective reactions of uneducated, uncivilized.
I see what you mean about getting back to older sources, but I'm wondering how it relates to the fact that we read these texts as buffered selves, as you call them.
Yeah.
So, for example, medieval subjectivity would be something quite different than our own, I think. So, how do we gain access to these texts in that respect?
Well, I think that there is a human capacity which comes out perhaps best in ethnography. There's an extraordinary human capacity when you think about it. If you really know you don't know, you really understand that you don't understand, which has been, I think, as I say, ethnographers, they're parachuted into, some society where they just don't really know how to go about it and how to relate to people, but they're unlike government house people who are saying, well, let's make these data shape up in our way. In order to do what they want to do, they have to really open themselves to the sense, I don't really understand, so. Now, very often they have the civilizational attitude, sometimes, some not. Some of these people have the civilizational attitude, some have a reductive view about this. Ultimately, Malinowski must have had an idea that you could find a purely intrapsychic explanation for all this, etc. Right? But they are showing that you can overcome this kind of, total view from totally outside, if you have the will to. So it does suppose. The supposition that I was saying earlier, that there's something here, has to precede that. But if it's really there, and if you have this capacity, this ethnographic capacity, which gets stronger and stronger as you have more and more contact and so on, you can overcome the fact that, indeed it rapidly becomes clear, as I was trying to say in a secular age, that it's not, you can't say these are different beliefs, that doesn't get to it. It really is a different sensibility
Right.
Yeah. I mean, buffer itself is a fact of my sensibility more than which that generates.
Okay, that explains. To get back to the paper, Disenchantment-Reenchantment, you also write about this topic with regard to your doctrine of strong evaluation.
Yeah.
Well, to give a summary, it centers on the fact that we make qualitative distinctions between higher and lower worth. So I'm wondering if you could explain some more how your account of strong evaluation, or the specific concept of strong evaluation, relates to your idea of reenchantment.
Yeah.
So how does a proper understanding of strong evaluation help to show what's wrong with total disenchantment, perhaps?
Well, yes. See, the thing is, let's look at from another angle what this exploration involves. And this exploration always involves a certain, if you like, personal search for a way of being in contact, in some kind of communion with. And as all these, I mean, we could use a new sense of the word spiritual, which I'm playing with, but of course that has so many overtones that it may lead to misunderstanding. But there's a kind of path that people can be on in life, including people who are totally atheistic and so on, in which they think there's a better way of being, more loving, more concerned, more, etc. Then I have a sense of that, and I have a sense that if I think through thoughts, go through meditation, go through certain disciplines, I can become that, or find a way to come closer to that. Now, this whole sense, that's not say judgment at first, but this whole sense is powered by a sense of strong evaluation. There's something, it's a higher way of being, and it's also something that can be confirmed or disconfirmed by what you, in the beginning, defined as progress on this path or going forward on this path, does not produce, something which you now recognize as higher. I mean, more typically, it's not. I'm not talking about total in another sense, disenchantment. It's not total sort of disbelief in it that eventuates, but I mean, very typically, if you look at the great spiritual thinkers, leaders of our history, they recognize, well, I was partly motivated by wanting to be, striking figure for people and so on, and that was part of what was pushing me along before, and now I see that I've got to, set that aside. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting kind of strong evaluation because it either confirms itself or it doesn't, and its shape, therefore, can change. Exactly what the distinction amounts to, I'll give a different account, I hope, at 105 than I gave at 25.
Right.
So, but this whole kind of path is not understandable without some kind of concept that I'm trying to describe by the term strong evaluation.
Yeah.
Something, it's not a better thing because I feel better because I think better. It's a better way to be. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a kind of confirmation, disconfirmation here, which is utterly unlike what we've understood as empirical propositions, confirmation, disconfirmation. So very powerful philosophical view which says that only, going back to the Vienna positivist, but a lot of people hold this view that the only issues of truth of any interest at all are those of confirmation, disconfirmation of descriptive propositions. And this quite different kind of logic to being on a search and finding that you're becoming more of that, or you're not becoming more of that, or you redefine that now because,
Yeah, related to this topic, you write in your paper Disenchantment-Reenchantment about disenchantment as a process of inwardness. Meanings are no longer placed in things, but in the human mind, which you call a mind-centered or human-centered view, which is a view where all value and meaning is projected onto a neutral world.
Yeah.
Now you argue against this, we might call an ontologically neutral stance, especially when it comes to moral meanings. So in that respect, what are the challenges in your view for those who reject projectivism in pursuit of a re-enchanted ethics? I think you're right that many have the intuition that this view of the world is completely meaningless is wrong, but what can be retrieved of this enchanted sensibility when we've obviously left behind the enchanted world in the original sense?
Well, I think, you see, we have actually everybody, and this is a very imperialistic claim, everybody has some sense of possibly being on a journey to a higher way of being, but they choose to, I think, misidentify it. I mean, in moral philosophy, which is, the area in which I've been cast by simply being in philosophy departments for a very long time, one of the antipositions to this is one derived from Kantianism, right? That we have reason alone can tell us that we ought to operate by universalizable maxims. I mean, in all sorts of ways. I mean, Habermas is one variant of this, and Rawls another variant of this, but Christina Korsgaard another. But that's the idea. It's reason which is dictating this. But I think that even that is a kind of misreading, because if you go to Kant and the starry sky above and the moral law within, the resonance of these expressions just shows that there's something else, something drawing us very, very strongly. So I think what we have is a universal human experience, but which can be, and this is, so the issue here is hermeneutic, right? A universal human experience that can be wrongly understood, and understood in a distorted way, and the distorted way prevents it from growing in a certain fashion, which it can do if we look at it in the perspective of, well, we're on a path, we're on a search, we're moving in this direction. And the confirmation there is, if you like, hermeneutic. I now understand better what I was all about it, and maybe I was totally wrong in this respect, but right in that respect, and so on, right? So they feel like the epistemological issue is, are there some human understandings and human changes and arriving at more valid conclusions which only can be captured with interpretations, right? Where the issue is this interpretation really correct or not? And the way you beat a bad interpretation is a better interpretation, but a really strong sense that that's a better interpretation. You've left something behind that should be left behind. And so this battle is going to go on for a great deal of time.
Sure.
I mean, it's impossible for us really to knock them off their perch, because they really have armored themselves against that. In other words, the place that they most show this kind of susceptibility to moving in a certain direction, they've already sort of wrapped that in a certain rationalistic cotton wool. That's all.
Maybe to focus on these metaethical issues, if you will, concerning strong evaluation, you argue that strong evaluations track some reality and can be criticized for misapprehending this reality, and that underlying strong evaluations there's supposed to be a truth to the matter, and that it lies in the nature of our strong evaluations to claim truth, reality, and objective rightness. Now, these are concepts that are quite familiar in the recent metaethical discussions. However, concepts such as self-understanding and interpretations are completely absent from those discussions. That's interesting to note in itself, I think. But I think your claims there suggest a kind of moral realism. But you, at the same time, seem reluctant to describe your view in these moral realist terms. So,
the thing is, I believe in moral realism, but not in there being a knockdown argument. Right? The way, if we disagreed on the nature of finest particles of physics, ultimately we would hope there would be a point where you would show that I was wrong we would just agree. I mean, I couldn't hold out any longer, or some third person comes along, right? So it's a notion of moral realism without that kind of clinching argument. Whereas, to get back to our example earlier of the really Kantian influence people, there's a notion of moral correctness, cognitivism, whatever the word is, but it's grounded on and thought to be unthinkable unless grounded on one of these supposedly totally tight arguments. Christine Korsgaard, everybody has a life plan, and they think it's a good life plan, it's a better life plan, but everybody else is too, so you're logically bound to, I'm logically to respect yours and you to respect mine, etc., etc. We get the notion of human rights deriving from this. Whereas I think that what is very powerful here is that this intuition of the universality of the human being becoming in the axial period and developing becomes very, very powerful in human life, and people find some way of finding an interpretation, a religious interpretation or non-religious interpretation, which seems to them to move them forward. So it's a moral realism without a kind of clinching answer that this is the right view. And so it does leave us in a little bit, puzzling situation, because, just thinking that there are, I look around, I see people, I know people with totally different, if you like, spiritual tradition from mine. I'm Christian, they're Buddhist. Something very, very impressive about that. How that all fits together, I don't know. So there's a certain amount of agnosticism here, the word has to be used in the right spirit. That there's something here.
That would be the realist aspect. That there's something here.
Yeah. Yes. That there is, some final clear interpretation of this, which my Kantian friends think they have.
Just a single one unique, yes.
Escapes me and will probably always escape us. Right? But, that's what, I think this is a very common view today, though some of the people who hold this view might be talked into thinking that they're really subjectivist. Because they kind of, the epistemological meta-theory that they're being fed is so powerful that if you don't agree with those people, you think
you must be subjective.
I must be, it must be. But I think there's another path here, which is truer to the experience, but also, in a puzzling fashion, it never reaches a point where now we see this is the right interpretation, all those other ones are partial.
Right. Okay. Related to this issue of realism is that you explicitly seek to retrieve a non-anthropocentric perspective on the good by employing the concept of strong evaluation. And you argue against projectivism and views such as Korsgaard that value emanates not just from ourselves but from the world in a sense. And in this respect you've often praised Iris Murdoch's concept of the good beyond the self.
Yeah.
So perhaps first the question, how do you conceive of Murdoch's reenchanted ethics, if you will, and what it has to say to us today for those who seek reenchantment?
Well, Murdoch is very interesting because she's in some ways sort of combined very Christian reference points, and I'm talking about some sort of novels like The Bell, etc. On one hand, with being, I think, really, when you pushed her, having a Buddhist, more Buddhist type position. So it's one of these very interesting writers who is moving around between two different perspectives with it. So you get from the novels, some of the writings, very strong sense that there are paths that are really important, but a kind of looseness of fitting into these paths. In that, I think she reflects what I think is an important feature of our world, which is worth reflecting on, that there is a new kind of ecumenicism growing. When I was much younger, ecumenical movement was starting, and the point was then, let's stop fighting, let's stop, bad-mouthing the other. There's something to respect here. Above all, let's kind of get together and be friends. I think the ecumenicism which emerges from what I'm trying to articulate as an outlook is stronger than that, because there's a notion of, you're something very different from me, but I have a sense that I can learn something from you, that it's something from your whole life and stance, right? Even if it's not exactly in the theology or non-theology that you are into yourself, and that also we can, as it were, accompany each other, that encourage each other in a certain sense in our paths, even though we are in a quite different path. Right? So there is this, but the background or assumption where all this makes sense is that guided strange position I'm trying to elaborate. These are different paths. They're, in one sense, obviously valid. You can go, some serious distance on them, but we can't, in the end, clearly say which. We're a little bit in the dark about that. And out of that understanding arises the sense that maybe we can learn from each other, we can encourage each other, we can strengthen each other's resolve. And that's what I call the ecumenicism of friendship, right? Now you see, which goes beyond just, world churches and kind of thing. Let's not say Luther is awful, or the papists, just abstaining from that. And I think that is part of the air we breathe to a certain extent. Now, of course, there are, in all the established bodies of religious doctrine and practice, there are people who are horrified by that and want to, close ranks and not allow any change and so on. So there's a fight within these different religious, spiritual, whatever, communities. It's a fight within them between people who respond to that, ecumenicism, and people who think of it as a mortal danger. And that is a very troubling situation that I think it's become our situation. It's the more troubling sometimes because the sort of mainstream very often get into old kinds of religious war mentalities like Christianity and Islam today, right? And so what you find is that, I get on very well with some Sufi friends, right, from West Africa, from Senegal. We really have that kind of experience of the ecumenicism of friendship when we talk about Iqbal and so on. But the Muslim world and the so-called Christian or ex-Christian world, there are forces which are trying to drive us into jihad on that side, and fighting back against Islam, Islamism on the other side. And, the Netherlands have fielders of people like that, and we have not quite as bad, but people of that kind in Quebec that we're fighting, etc. So it's a very strange, interesting situation that you have these very different understandings of what it is to exist, coexist with these spiritual paths, and that a lot rides on who wins out in each civilization. Whether we're shooting at each other or we're able to learn from each other.
So wondering, apart from this non-anthropocentric view, are there any other ways in which Murdoch directly has inspired your views on strong evaluation?
No, really. There's just all sorts of descriptions that she gives of certain. I recognize in them, like I do in a great many of the poets I'm studying for the thing I'm writing. You recognize that she is capturing something about the relationship to the world. And
right. I think when it comes to defending this extra-human or non-anthropocentric perspective, there's another fundamental issue, the issue of what kind of ontology might be needed for reenchantment.
yeah.
And as I've been reading your work, one of your major inspirations here is Heidegger. So how do you see the importance of Heidegger for understanding strong evaluation and for understanding strong values, especially with regard to this ontological question?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the more I read Rilke, the more I think that Heidegger sort of took it all from Rilke. Rilke, yeah.
Right, yeah.
I mean, even the word thing, you see, when you read the Duino Elegies closely towards the end, you get that use of the word das Ding, right, which obviously Heidegger drew on. Now, I think that what Heidegger is pointing to with that is the way in which surrounding our understanding of certain things, but even things in a completely devoid of all resonance sense to start with, objects, etc. And outside of our being able to grasp them, use them, instrumentalize them, there is this repressed sense of them as having meaning for us, and he tries to put it in this four, the Gefühl, right? You know, the human and the divine and the, what is it, and God's. Again, my adult brain is not moving fast enough. So I think he's on to something, but I think that you could go much farther than he does in trying to define it if you go through Rilke. Now, with the proviso that Rilke is not giving us a definitive story about the meaning that it has for us, which will replace all of the stories in Trinity. Whereas Heidegger still seems to be writing as a philosopher that's giving us a definitive story. Which is interesting because it's different from the story of Sein and Sight, right? It's not at all like that in some very important ways. So it's, in that sense, a discovery. But on the other hand, I don't think he's thought out enough what, as it were, belongs to this discovery, which is the pluralism in the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. And that there isn't a kind of definitive way of characterizing it, and that it doesn't have. It has certain consequences for how we act. I mean, like the question about technology shows very important. But again, what the horizon of meaning around these objects that we're using, which takes us beyond the technological sense of what can be, is plural. Okay? And it's that which is troubling to philosophers. I mean, hints are there, in Heidegger, Dichten and Denken are really closely intertwined with each other. So the hints are there, but I think there is a further step to take.
So philosophy is in a way holding us captive on this particular issue.
Yeah, that's right. There's something, there's another way of living in the world and living with these objects, which he calls things. Rilke, but there's another, you have to say, plurality of ways of living in the world. Certainly, but there's certainly another way to the technological stance. These are objects we can use and reorganize and so on, but other ways. And it's that. So there's around Heidegger a little bit of a self-generated mystique, right? No, I'm Gott, come and sweat, all that kind of stuff, which is a bit irritating.
I see. So what, in your view, is it exactly about philosophical practice that's resisting that this phenomenon that we're trying to understand in terms of strong evaluation is getting away from us?
Yeah. the practice that resists it is the practice of seeing the world as a set of objects that we can get objective knowledge of, and that's very useful for using them and so on. And that's that's all there is. It's this kind of epistemological blockage. The epistemological blockage, of course, itself has ethical basis. I mean, what is admired is the disenchanted human being who therefore can control his or her own fate, humanity's own fate, and can stand up and remake the world and do a lot of good because we know how to plan this. That kind of satisfied sense of really the power that human beings have, which I think underlies the whole Cartesian.
Yes.
So there's a kind of ethic, a way of being involved in that.
But then it would be only a particular kind of philosophical practice that's keeping us away from understanding strong.
Exactly. So the whole hermeneutic dimension is considered to be taboo. I mean, it's just waffling around. You know. That's what you feel like saying this. And that's not serious. You know. Get that out of the philosophy department and send it off to the literature department. And we can get on with.
Are there perhaps any other philosophical exemplars that are should be mentioned to you, if it inspired your views on strong motivation?
Yeah, Ricoeur is a very important figure for me over the years, because I think Ricoeur, I mean, what I really admired about him was that he read everything. He didn't have one of these views that's so common either in Paris or in New York. The other is all saying totally useless things and forget about it. He took the trouble to read all this stuff, and he moved back and forth between Chicago and Paris, etc. And but he was somebody, I think, who defended in a very interesting way this kind of hermeneutic view, and said some very interesting things about the symbol, and which connect up, in my view, with the use of that term in German Romanticism.
Okay. Do you think Hegel comes in at this?
Yeah, I mean, Hegel, I learned a lot about the Romantic period when I was preparing to write my book on Hegel, because I very quickly saw, and we totally lost the...
Okay.
I very quickly saw that you couldn't understand what was going on in Hegel if you didn't look at the whole background of the generation of the 1790s, Hölderlin and Novalis, the two Schlegels, and Fichte and so on, right? The whole thing was really in that Romantic period. Then he turns against them because he thinks there's got to be a rational solution to this. Now, the rationality of Hegel is not the rationality of the positivists, not the rationality of Carnap at all. Sure. But it is a devaluation of these other languages. They are not, you have art, you have religion, which gives you mere Vorstellung images, and then you have Vernunft. And the idea is, here's a definitive statement of what's going on here, which is vaguely being hinted at and sensed by earlier figures of Schelling and people like that. But you can kind of transcend that. And I think, I can understand the feeling, but I think it's a really false, it's a move into nowhere. I mean, or making claims that can't be in any way sustained. But it's very interesting because it's totally unlike, as I said, unlike Carnap, he's not another human, it's just something very, very different. It's really fascinating. I mean, it's something very extraordinary about it. And also, we all owe Hegel a lot because he really started to think history philosophically, right? Which Fichte didn't and Kant didn't really, and so on. And we've never stopped doing that. And we should never stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But he kind of inaugurated that.
Yeah. Okay, I want to turn now to your own ontological vocabulary. I think it's interesting that in your work, as part of this effort of reenchantment, that you've employed the concept of ontology as an attack on a disenchanted, naturalist-inspired metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in your paper Ethics and Ontology, you ask what we are committed to ontologically by our ethical views. And in the secular age, you repeat the question, what ontology can underpin our moral commitments? Now, part of your answer is that we should respond at least to the following challenge. So either we correct this naturalist ontology, or we must revise our moral phenomenology, as you call it, our understanding of moral experience in terms of strong value and higher worth. In the conclusion of your paper, Ethics and Ontology, you argue that we must suffer one of two things in this respect: the pain of resisting the phenomenology, or the pain of challenging the ontology. So with regard to this tension between moral phenomenology and naturalist ontology, do you think there is a way of overcoming this tension? And if not, how should we deal with it? That is, in an increasingly naturalizing climate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to always be running against the stream of a naturalizing climate. So to the extent that, well, I don't know, who can say, I was going to say there will always be, anybody starts a sentence like that, you know you're probably wrong. But from where I sit now, I don't see any near end of this very powerful naturalistic, naturalizing climate, which really means the methods of natural science or the ultimate way of understanding the world. We can understand human beings by patterns of firing in the brain, which are, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So it'll always be running upstream against that. And one of the weaknesses of it, if you like, rhetorical weaknesses of it, is that it can't say in very clear terms, can be understood by the other side, what is involved here, because it involves a quite complex story, people on different paths, and they're getting us some very powerful sense of confirmation or disconfirmation as they move along this path. So what are the things that are, if you like, an ontology of things? What are the things? Well, there's not a thing here exactly, but there are certain stages in the development of life where really something is very worthwhile and you get there or you don't get there or you revise it, etc. Right? So that's so weird from the standpoint of the other ontology. The other ontology is so powerful because it belongs to the whole world of technological control and so on, which of course has a downside to it, which we're not learning about. But people can say, sure, it has that, but then we have to get better technology, etc. So it seems to me just inevitable that the power and importance of that stance is such that it will always generate people who are really into it. I think, wow, this is great, this is what it's all about. And so there will always be tremendous resistance to this other ontology. So all you can do here is act hermeneutically, try to give an account of what's going on, and you follow the other path, which hits people. And this is what happens. Certain people say, yeah, there's something there. And so some experience of mine that's kind of been in the shade, but now I see, there's something going on like what is being described by this. So there'll be, what happens with one's graduate students? Some just respond to this, some don't.
Well, on this particular topic, many are quite skeptical about the possibility of drawing any ontological conclusions from an account of moral experience. So what are your views on this matter? So perhaps the question could be put in this way, that it's not clear what you think about the scope of moral phenomenology, since your account of moral experience clearly has an ontological purpose. But what are we committed to ontologically by this phenomenology of strong evaluation?
Well, there's two phases to answer that. It could just be the minimal thing that there is a real distinction in between being what I am now and being what I could become, or what if I have already started to become it, then between that and where I started. And for most people, it would be both directions. It's different from where I started and different from where I might get. Right? Mm-hmm. There's something really valid here. This is very important. Right? And this is not just because it suits my taste or what have you. Right? So that's, now, what underlies that, and then you get, almost inevitably, you get these different stories, a Buddhist story, a Christian story, mm-hmm. which we're not going to ever succeed, I don't think, in establishing one as against the other. So mm-hmm. there's a kind of, but obviously there is a deeper ontology somewhere that makes this the case, right? So that's, that's something further to be explored. Mm-hmm. And as each of us goes on his or her path, we get, sometimes we can get really much closer to understanding what this path mm-hmm. is all about, right?
So in this account, how would you define ontology?
Well, ontology is, whatever it is. And what there is, interestingly enough, is this dimension of movement for human beings, different from simply how they feel, different from ordinary happiness. And this is not just a projection.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe to add another aspect of your work, most commentators understand your account of strong individuation as the formulation of a philosophical anthropology. However, one of central tenets of your view is that you seek to make room for non-human sources of value. And we already spoke about Murdoch and Heidegger and Rilke in this respect. And it seems to me that your effort to transcend subjectivism or anthropocentrism in moral thinking reaches beyond mere philosophical anthropology. So, for example, in a reply to some critics of sources of the self, you explain that not just naturalist views, but any anthropocentrism pays a terrible price, as you put it, by suppressing its underlying ontology. And by contrast, you explain that your own view is closer to those of theists, deep ecologists. And in this regard, do you see yourself as moving beyond anthropological concerns, so that on top of the question of the nature of human agency, you add an extra question, a more metaphysical question, about the nature of the world that typically inspires human agency?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I wouldn't say it's a different anthropology that human beings are in the universe, in a way which calls on them to relate to it. It seems to me. So it's a different anthropology. It's a different anthropology is bound up with this different ontology. Yeah, and that's what the argument again is another way of looking at the argument that's going on all the time. Is there anything beyond either what we feel or what our reason tells us we have to do? Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, yes, there is, but that, once again, it's only something that can be retrieved hermeneutically, mm-hmm. right? By the way we move through life and either don't get anywhere or get somewhere or change our view about where we're going, etc.
I think it's interesting in this respect that most commentators who accept or even praise your philosophical anthropology and your moral phenomenology seem to lose track some way of what you're trying to achieve on the ontological level. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there's Bernard Williams in his review of Sources of the Self, who argues that from a strong base in experience, he says, Taylor very rapidly moves uphill, metaphysically speaking. Too rapidly for Williams' taste. So what about that response?
Yeah. No, I quite understand that. Werner was a very close friend of mine, so I sort of know what the difference was about. But he has this very strong sense of, which comes out in his internal and external reasons, this very strong sense of, the sense each of us has, of what really is important, what really is going to fulfill our lives, and so on. In that, there's a kind of convergence with my discussion of the ethic of authenticity, and with Qingli and him. But he was definitely an atheist, and he, he resisted all of that. I mean, it's a case of we're very close friends with somebody and really exchange, even though they're very, very different. Yeah. Now, there's another point in there that I wanted to take up, which is it was just there at the edge of my mind, and it's gone again, but it'll come back, I'm sure.
I'm wondering, does it make sense to characterize your view in terms of an inward movement towards the human subject and an outward movement towards the reality, the metaphysical reality to which we respond as human beings? Or do you perhaps reject this inner-outer boundary as an image for understanding value?
No, it's an image, but it has its misleading character too. You see, because everybody has an inward idea, like Cartesianism has an inward idea, look inside the mind and so on. And it's not that kind of inward. And I remember what I was reading against my head, which I think is relevant to this. Metaphysics. There's an absolute muddle, I think, about the use of the word metaphysics. I mean, Jürgen keeps talking about post-metaphysical. I mean, when did that happen? The thing, if you go back to Aristotle, what metaphysics is doing is it saying, well, look at all these individual sciences. We have the physica, we have the ethica, the politica, and so on. How does it all fit together? In his metaphysics, he's trying to make an overarching view. Now, I think there's never going to be a post-metaphysical era in the sense that there's never going to be a moment when we don't ask that question. Mm-hmm. It's just that if you have a totally reductive view, if you like, metaphysics collapses into physics, right? Everything can be the human thinking, human emotions, all that can be explained by the sort of movement of these particles, etc. Then it all collapses. So when people say post-metaphysical, they might mean, well, people still think that there's something, that you can't answer all these questions out of physics, in which case there would be nothing there. But Jürgen doesn't think that either. He's not a reductivist in that sense, right? So I don't know what he thinks metaphysics is. And you can see that the meaning of metaphysics necessarily is sliding around, because there's this minimal sense of what it's doing for us. It's putting it all together. Mm-hmm. And then there's a maximal sense where we say the way to put it all together involves invoking things, or causes or what, which aren't dealt with in any of the existing row of, in modern term physics, psychology, sociology, right? So there could be the notion that something, you have to have recourse to something. And, of course, in the modern philosophy tradition, something like Leibniz, it's all this spooky, non-physical stuff, which is definitely holding it all together, right? And I mean, maybe he means that, but I mean, there's no one defense of Leibniz or Proportion, so it's difficult to see. So there's kind of muddle about that. People haven't thought through the different senses in which the word can be used, and
to add to that, you raised the issue of how ethics and ontology or metaphysics are related in all your major publications, but there's always something tentative in the way you raise this topic. And you often insist that it's not all that clear how we should go about answering these ontological questions. And is this perhaps because you believe that ontological issues can only be treated hermeneutically, as you said, in the sense that we never really arrive at a final or complete description of the background ontology that makes sense of our actions? So, what is the place of hermeneutics with regard to this ontological issue?
Yeah, well, I think hermeneutics properly understood is you can never end it. It doesn't get to be, you could have, when we get this, when we ever do this theory of everything the physicists want to get to, the ultimate view of what the constituents of matter are and how they all relate. We probably never will do that, but it's a conceivable point. Right? But when you get to hermeneutics, there's always the possibility open, saying, well, this really accounts for a lot of what's going on here, but there are things that you haven't really captured. So let's just improve your interpretation. There's no point where we just know we are not susceptible to further such a move.
And certain philosophical practices are have an issue with that.
Yeah.
Right. I think your views in retrieving realism either suggest another approach, or perhaps it can be seen as a variation on the same theme. So in this book you argue with Hubert Dreyfus that we're best advised to be pluralistically realist about these ontological differences.
Yeah.
And you allow the possibility of multiple descriptions of reality, all of which may be true. And I'm curious whether your pluralistic robust realism, as you call it, is a shift in emphasis or maybe a change of mind as compared to your view that naturalist ontology must be rejected, or at least revised in favor of moral phenomenology, what we spoke about earlier. So to me, this last claim, the claim you made in the paper Ethics on Ontology, seems more critical or perhaps more radical than adopting a pluralistic view.
Well, yeah, the pluralistic view is itself adopted very tentatively. It's saying, well, how we don't see how we fit together, really, mind and physics. We're still very, uncertain about that, etc. And you can't say we're bound to get to final account here. And maybe when we get to as final as we can get, there might be certain dimensions here which we can't relate to each other. In other words, the metaphysical search for something uniting it all may be ultimately frustrated. Yeah, who can say? I mean, perhaps Bert signed that with a little bit more belief that that's the way it is than I did. Because for me, it's a possibility that you can't rule out. See?
Well, at the same time, you suggest that one superior approach, in this case moral phenomenology, the phenomenology of strong evaluation, can be used to show the inadequacy of other views, such as a naturalist ontology. So is that a way of trying to salvage our different languages of self-understanding?
No, I mean, we don't do away with physics, we just do away with the idea that physics can explain human life.
Issues of strong evaluation.
Yeah. So nobody is yet challenging physics in its own domain, right? And so what we are ideally looking to do in metaphysics is have a way of taking that knowledge and this knowledge and putting it all together in a way which can be coherently understood. But maybe that's going to elude us, that we can't. And who can say, you see?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess Bert was thinking of, well, we have Western medicine, we have Chinese medicine, we have Indian medicine, and we're kind of puzzled how it all, I mean, obviously some of these things work, and a lot of people are going to Ayurvedic as well as going to hospital and getting some benefit from it. Will we ever have a global understanding of medicine which somehow integrates all this and we can understand why? Maybe, but who can, nobody can say it's guaranteed.
I want to ask you more about the central claim of retrieving realism, namely that our grasp of the world is not simply a representation within us, but resides rather in our dealing with reality or our contact with reality. I wonder how this contact theory relates to specifically moral understanding. So you and Dreyfus write about getting in sync with the demands of the universe and about balancing ourselves in view of these demands. And at the end of the book you hint towards the phenomenology of Samuel Totes that might be a model for understanding value, the way we relate to a moral reality. Now, there is a moral theory in analytic philosophy that can be seen as reenchanting in this way. under the name of robust realist non-naturalism. I think it's no coincidence that it's both called robust realism. This is an anti-naturalist position which rejects scientific naturalism for being reductive, etc. And it locates moral facts and properties in the world as existing independently, in a way, of human sensibility, and that our judgments seek to represent. So I'm wondering what you think of this anti-naturalist representational approach to ethics as an effort of reenchantment, because it's in a way non-naturalist, but it builds on the model of natural science by positing these objective moral facts in the world independent of human beings. So I'm not sure whether this comes close to your own view in a way, or that you see it rather as symptomatic of the representational mediational epistemology that you reject. And I think there's room for both interpretations of your works.
Yeah, but there's truth in both interpretations. You see, of course, everything I'm saying could be re-described in the language of properties. Right? That is kind of property of human life, that it has these possible stages forward. But I don't find that helpful, because people say, well, what are these properties? How do you reel this up? And I think, therefore, you get closer to showing what the alternative is if you try to explain what it is to make steps forward and why and what the experience is. So rather than focusing on this idea of properties and what exactly are they, I'm focusing on the paths that you can be following, and so it's experiential all the way along. Whereas the other procedure leaves you with a kind of puzzlement. How do I experience this?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, that clarifies. I'm wondering about the nature of strong value. You argue that strong values are not rendered valid by our own desires and choices, but rather stand independent of these as the other standards that are normative for our desires. So, what is the nature of these strong values implicit in our evaluations if they cannot be traced back to contingent desire? And this seems to suggest an independent reality of some sort, which enables us to judge our own desires in terms of higher and lower value. And, well, this conception of an independent reality seems also in line with what you say in the language animal, in which you argue that human meanings, or metabiological meanings as you call them, have their own kind of independent reality, as against the biological meanings we share with non-human animals. So what are the issues?
Yeah, well, that's the same. I mean, it's the same issue with another language, metabiological being, a way of touching on these issues of human meaning. So once again, there is this experience of searching, finding, as one changes and discovers more what the direction is, it either confirms or disconfirms. But the confirmation is in the experience itself. So the issue is, you could say, well, why should I trust that? Well, if there's really some truth to this, you're just throwing your life into the ash can, if you aren't following this logic. And no one really does. People have a sense that that's a really meaningful life for me. Doctors who are earning hundreds of thousands of dollars and saying, "No, this is not for me. It's not a meaningful life. I go to the Congo with Disenchantment-Reenchantment." It's very. If you just said, "Well, that's like you prefer red wine to rosé," look at you.
I want to ask about this, what you call this universal feature that people are on a path and aim to climb to a higher way of life. I think it's a way of expressing that there are lots of people who would not recognize themselves in that kind of formulation.
Yeah.
What would you say to those kinds of people?
Well, I think there are two phases to this. First of all, they recognize themselves in another formulation which has close relation to this. Take Donald Trump as an example. He has this same set of judgment standards, levels, except he thinks he's attained them all, right? And he can look down on everyone else, right? So, because of the art of the deal, being clever, being able to draw people to you and so on, obviously he gets a tremendous kick out of that. And so, it's kind of like the same ontology, but thinking of yourself as being, like I think of myself as I'm St. Francis, right? It's a kind of the same, set of tiers. I'm not subjectively better, but I think I've got there. And when you look at Trump, you say, well, is there not almost inevitably in this kind of self-placement, not in there being a ladder, because there is a ladder, but in this kind of self-placement, is there not a high degree of delusion? The answer clearly yes.
The answer is yes. Okay. Perhaps to take this picture of getting in sync with reality elsewhere, I'm also wondering what you think of the positions of John McDowell and Achille Belgrami. So they also seek a kind of reenchantment by defending a view of values as emanating from the world, rather than just from ourselves. And I think McDowell's moral phenomenology has much in common with your own, but he sees ontological questions as neither necessary nor sufficient for understanding value. And I think in the same way Belgrami speaks of the external calling of value from the world, quite explicitly, but he also seems to avoid the term ontology or even metaphysics when discussing the source of value. So if their views can perhaps be seen as strong evaluation without moral sources, how does your view relate to those kinds of positions?
Well, I think that we probably are partly divided by just purely semantic questions, see? This is connecting up to your question earlier about people who think there are these facts in the world that draw. Right? They're obviously, I don't mind that, but I prefer my way of putting it. They do mind that. Somehow they're worried about that. And I think they're wrong to be worried about that, but the way to dispel that sense of is a closer understanding of what it is to live a human life and to pass through these different phases and so on. And then this is the best way you can put it, that there is this kind of getting into this kind of, for instance, to get to the whole issue we keep circling around, this kind of sense of relation to the world, getting into sync with it, is something that, answers something very deep in us, that fulfills a very deep drive or aspiration in us, and that some aspirations are deeper than others, like, et cetera, even for Trump, you see. He doesn't want to be a philosopher. That way of trying to understand it, I think, is the best you can do.
And you see McDowell and Belgrami as companions in this respect. Well, an obvious difference with Belgrami's enchantment is that he explicitly presents himself as being an atheist, of course. So in this respect, commentators such as Owen Flanagan and Quentin Skinner have accused you of trying to sneak in the Christian God in a way in your account of strong individuation, by pressing these ontological questions and by developing this non-anthropocentric perspective. So what's your response to that charge? In what sense have religious concerns motivated your views on strong individuation? Or perhaps to what extent are strong individuations in need of this theistic framework?
Well, I don't think that they are in need of the theistic framework, but I think that there are these, as I said, plurality of paths, and mine takes a theistic form. That is the kind of openness, love, generosity, whatever you want to call it, agape, right, is which I aspire to make sense to me in the light of love coming down, right? Receiving as well as giving. And that's what makes sense to me. Now, I understand other people have the same structural understanding paths, really getting somewhere. It's against just thinking you're getting somewhere, and don't have that. The nature of their path is not defined in those terms, which I find very interesting. I like to learn about it, but I think it's not. I don't see. They seem to think that there's some insight to be gained by saying that other way, theistic way, doesn't work at all, which I don't feel reciprocally.
Yes, I want to raise an issue about the way you connect ontological concerns with issues of moral motivation. So you bring theism not just to debate these ontological questions, but also to open up a more practical question. A question about what we need on a more political level to accomplish what morality demands of us. So in Sources of the Self, you argue that an increasingly secularizing culture in this respect might be aiming higher than its moral sources can sustain. And in the Catholic modernity, you continue to discuss the high demands for solidarity and benevolence in the Western world. And you explain that such high standards need strong sources. And you talk about the doubt that can arise for a non-theistic viewpoint for ethics in a way that does not arise for theism. So how do you think about these claims today? Do you perhaps see social tendencies that make sense of your analysis? For example, the moral inability or perhaps moral indifference of Europe to respond properly to the influx of refugees.
Yeah, but I mean less making discrimination there, because I think there are stronger and weaker, as it were, atheistic or non-theistic forms of commitment. Right? But the point that there is a real danger of the demands of solidarity, which are part of our political system, and whatever sources are, whatever their potential, they're held in a weak enough fashion that we easily break off from. And I think the present populist wave is a clear example of that, right? So it's just a minority, not a minority. It's not everybody who is not breaking away from the demands of this when the going gets slightly tough. So I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't withdraw any particular claim about one type of source being better than another type of source, but I think the issue of, as I use the term in my sources book, moral sources and the moral demands being out of phase with each other is a real problem. A real danger, which we're living.
Okay. Maybe some last questions about recovering the sacred.
Yeah.
In that paper you stress that moral demands are not just our doing, but they're neither inscribed in the universe independently of us, to mark the contrast with the originally enchanted world. At the same time, you seem to make room for what you call the inescapable place for the anchored, notion of an anchored reality, which I understand as the background ontology that can make sense of our responses. And in this context, you appeal to the notion of an anchored reality as opposed to what you call the interstitial realm, that arises in the interface between humans and world. So could you explain some more why it is important to make this distinction between anchored and interstitial for understanding reenchantment?
Well, because, I think that's another way of talking about whether there's a very strong sense of the sources that can give you this power to act out whatever the accepted social ethic is, right? And there is a way of living in the world where you're not concerned with developing those sources, right? Whatever that means. And I think for all of it, it means to some degree getting another relation with the universe surrounding us. Who can live in the world in a way where they're not concerned with strengthening those sources, and then they become very much part of the problem when we have a civilization and structure of universal democracy. I mean, human rights democracy, not universal to everybody, but universal in the society, universal human rights for the society. When we have, and plus some kind of sense of what we owe to human beings outside when they come as refugees. So we have all that, and if we're living in a way which is not nourishing our sources, we're going to fail to live up to that with various terrible consequences.
Okay. In that particular paper, you also argue that a revised notion of an anchored reality can be affirmed in the interface. So a revised notion of an anchored reality would be one that is different from the originally enchanted one. And you say that it can be affirmed in the interface for those who are open to it. But this seems to suggest a possibility, not so much a necessity. And how does that relate to your claim that there's an inescapable place for the anchored, in your view?
Well, I think that maybe that's, I might put that a little bit differently, but we're certainly on another point I made earlier to that. I think that the account that I'm giving of human experience, which permits of these degrees of approach and non-approach, is actually everybody's experience, and I think the interpretation of our world, which completely, screens that out, is a misinterpretation. And I think possibly that there could be a connection between that misinterpretation and not rising to the occasion of strengthening the sources enough. There could be, but not necessarily are. But there certainly is the possibility that this kind of relationship, something deeper, is not at all recognized. That people think it all comes from inside. But nevertheless, like if you respond to the Kantian thing and what the stories got, there's some relation to the cosmos, but it's mediated by the sense of awe within purity. And that could be, for some people, that could be, because it goes along with the sense of the reason in me is, just infinitely higher than the rest in me, right? Well, that kind of, in one way, unanchored, because not recognizing anything out there, in another way, potentially for that person powerful commitment. He could, but on another level, I want to make a claim that their sense of everything being inside us, if you like, is in purity, reason, and their sense of reason is a bad, is an inadequate self-understanding.
I want to ask how this pluralistic stance you take on these issues of anchored interstitial, how that relates to the revisionary stance of the actual revolutions. So the paths of hope, self-transformation, and salvations. What becomes of those if they're among lots of other kinds of strong evaluations that people make as post-actual agents?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
if the necessity aspect is left out or undermined in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say, let me try to say it again. I think two things. There is the self-understood notion or understanding of what it is to move up or down, right? And then there is a recognition that that is what is going on. There is a moving up and down going on. And you have, post-Kantians today do not recognize that, see? When you listen to their rhetoric and so on, you can see that there is a sense of higher and lower which is operating, but they're not accepting that at all because that belongs to what they consider to be very bad alternative, and they very often have religion in there. So there is, I'll use Hegel language, there's Ansicht and Fürsicht. Everybody Ansicht is beyond, I think, understood in the way I'm trying to, with the notion of path and moving up. Everybody. But some people are, in a sense, obfuscating that by dressing it up as something else. Or, even more, utilitarians that they think that what's right is just simply add up the utils and so on. What makes you committed to maximizing the utils for everybody? Well, they just kind of think, well, sympathy, which I think it would take a long time to go into what's wrong with Hume and that kind of things. It starts off as a kind of explanatory force that underpins the development, but it actually is a value, right?
Yes.
So there is the fact that everybody's doing it, and there is the fact that some people don't understand clearly
What they're doing. Right.
But they can still participate in the development of social ethic and maybe even in various ways rise to the occasion doing that. And one of the big differences between that and various religious outlooks is that they're operating on the sense of the dignity of the person. I mean, they would feel lowered if they were not living up to this, right? If it was a lower category.
Yeah.
And whereas something like Christian notion of agape takes you in another kind of direction, the Buddhist notion of anatta takes you in another kind of direction. So that makes a real difference. But on another level, there is a difference about the way we understand this. See? Where I want to make a very strong, brutal claim that they're wrong and I'm right.
Right.
Their self-understanding is wrong. But it doesn't mean that it's the same thing as people who think of something outside them, people think of something merely inside them. It's not the same difference as people who don't really have a very strong source. People who do have a very strong source. It's another...
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, the final question. On reenchantment in your current work, so am I right to assume you're working on the second part of the language animal now?
Yeah, that's right. I'm looking at certain the marks of literature come from that.
Could you give us a sense of what your line of argument is there and how it relates to reenchantment?
Yeah, I mean, what I was saying earlier about that there's a new kind of stance towards it, that one has a work of art that gives you a very powerful sense, but you aren't claiming this is the final account of the world such that, right, we have this relation to it. There's a kind of sense of best maybe expressed in Haman's idea of translating. This, from our human point of view, restatement of something there, which we can't get to in its own terms itself. A little bit of Kantian Dianzik versus phenomenon type distinction, but I don't want to push that.
I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
I really appreciate it. Okay, thanks.